Welcome everyone to Evangelizing Eastern Orthodoxy, where our goal is to understand Orthodox worldview and doctrine in order to communicate the gospel to our friends. My name is John Diakos. Well, thanks for joining us. Today we have two guests, Scott and Christian, and we're going to be talking with them about the issue of converts to Eastern Orthodoxy. But first, I'll ask them to introduce themselves. Scott, first, tell us about yourself, what your ministry role is, and from where your interest in Orthodoxy stems.
Yeah, for sure. First off, John, thanks so much for having us on. It's an honor to join you to have this important conversation. So just a little bit about me. I am the pastor of a Baptist church in just outside of Toronto, about 30 minutes away from Toronto. I forgot which direction it is there. But the church is called Northminster Baptist Church. So I'm the lead pastor there. And as far as my interest in Orthodoxy, the Orthodox Church, it's stemmed from a trip my wife and I took with a group from our former church a few years ago, and we did a tour through Paul's missionary journey in the seven churches in Revelation. And so we got to see some of the historical sites, but also some of the Greek Orthodox churches. Our tour guide was Greek Orthodox, and we got to tour some of the churches and some of the monasteries. And it was the first time my interest really peaked there. But more so recently, just a few members of my congregation began asking questions about the Orthodox Church and just what it means to be Protestant, and it got us into conversations in that direction. So fairly new to reading primary sources and digging into that kind of stuff, but that's kind of a little bit of background to my interest in what in this conversation.
Terrific. And Christian, same questions for you. Tell us a bit about yourself, what your ministry role is, and from where your interest in Orthodoxy stems.
Wonderful. Yes. And I am also pleased to be here, John. Thank you for having us. Very quickly, I am a pastoral resident at Grace Fellowship Church. That's on the west end of Toronto. For those who don't know, a resident means I'm not fully ordained pastor. I'm there. It's a kind of a training situation to hopefully send me off as a pastor at another church when the time comes. Full-time work technically. But I'm also a full-time student, so I'm finishing some studies in church history. My interest in Eastern Orthodoxy goes back a few years. I studied history at university, and in a seminar on early modern religion, I presented a discussion paper to my class on Protestantism. And one of the young ladies in the class introduced herself, said it was fascinating, and she said she was Russian Orthodox, and she wanted to hear all about what Protestants believe. She never really encountered a Protestant who actually knew anything about church history. So that was my initial contact. But like Scott, my deeper interest came years later. About 2 years ago, a few young people at my church mentioned that they were getting interested in Eastern Orthodox. One young lady who she's Greek by background and learning a bit about her culture and history. And then a young man at university just encountered it and didn't know what to do about it. So it was really in the context of actual ministry and questions I realized I need to dig in a bit and really understand what's going on. So that's that.
Yes, look, it certainly does seem to be an area where more and more questions are coming out. And recently, you both co-authored an article in the Gospel Coalition Canada entitled Evangelical Pastors and the Challenge of Eastern Orthodoxy, which is why we're chatting today. It addresses the issues of evangelicals who are converting to Orthodoxy, as the name suggests. Firstly, how did you come to the point of saying to one another, we really should write about this? What was it that you were noticing?
Yeah, I'll go first on that one. A couple of things kind of came together. We were both thinking of separate articles, and in conversation between the two of us and a group of friends, the idea came for writing a joint article, and so we ran with that. But one of the things that I was seeing was myself, and as Christian mentioned as well, there's a number of pastors are just getting questions about Eastern Orthodoxy, Protestantism, and those kind of questions. And there's a number of resources that could point to for pastors, for Protestants converting to Roman Catholicism, for example. but there wasn't much for evangelical Protestant pastors about Eastern Orthodoxy.
Mm.
And so we decided let's write something for pastors. So that article is targeted for pastors and kind of how they can respond in their own churches and thinking through that. And for me personally, part of why I wanted to write something like that was because I needed something like that. I had had conversations that I didn't have answers to, and so it helped me think through some of those answers. So it really was and the idea was to give pastors a resource for them to think through some of these questions to help their members of their congregations.
Mm.
I could just add a bit there.
Please.
I think with Scott and I, where Scott's a dear brother, I look up to him, and I remember we were grabbing coffee, and I also had the opportunity to preach at Scott's church, and we were noticing that some of the keen people in congregations, where I think it was at your church, Scott, where someone mentioned they were reading the Apocrypha for the first time and interested in some of that church history. So not specifically Eastern Orthodox, but just an awareness that there were certain questions floating around that not a lot of resources on for evangelicals. And then I think I shared with Scott when we were grabbing coffee another time about the young man at my previous church who got into Eastern Orthodoxy, and just chatting about that and realizing for Roman Catholicism, you could find 20 books, 30 podcasts, and everything in between for Eastern Orthodoxy, especially in the Canadian context. I imagine it's different in other places, where kind of this up and coming movement as we understand it, and not a lot of resources readily accessible. And just realizing that we have something that can contribute in this conversation. And I think, like Scott, it was, I want to write this article because I want to have a better handle of what's going on. I have a lot of ideas floating around in my head, but putting it on paper, I think that was a helpful exercise for us as well, even. Yeah.
It's helpful, and it's helpful stimulating the thought of your readers as well, because I know there are many who are struggling with this issue.
Certainty for Life, an invitation to Eastern Orthodoxy, is a compelling exploration of faith, assurance, and the search for peace with God, written especially for those from an Eastern Orthodox background. Drawing on personal stories, biblical teaching, and the wisdom of early church fathers, the book addresses the deep longing for certainty that many experience in their spiritual lives. In Australian Presbyterian, Mark Powell writes, "Certainty for Life is a book which I hope will, by the grace of God, make a profound and far-reaching impact. It is a book to buy, read, and then give prayerfully away. Certainty for Life comes highly recommended." Certainty for Life is available in print, ebook, and audiobook at certaintyforlife.com.
What is it that is attracting converts, do you think?
There's a couple things that keep coming up in conversations. First is just some of the good things that we can point to in Eastern Orthodoxy, and some of the shared theology that we might have on things like the doctrine of God and whatnot. And there's a robust commitment to Trinitarian theology and all that, which is wonderful. But then there's also just in conversations I've had, there's a perception. The first interaction most people have, and it seems to be mostly young men, is via social media, and they see an Orthodox priest, and there's an image of masculinity there that they're attracted to, and there's a commitment there that they're attracted to, and there's something inviting about the experience that they're attracted to, and so it's got that image. Another thing that's come up in conversations that I've had is just it's not Rome. And it's growing up in evangelical churches. These young men have heard of Roman Catholicism as kind of the boogeyman, but here's Eastern Orthodoxy, and it's different from us, but it's also not Roman Catholic. And so it's intriguing in that sense. And part of it too is just the emphasis in Eastern Orthodoxy is very experiential. And for evangelicals who grew up in kind of a dry intellectual kind of environment, which is not to say evangelicalism is just dry intellectualism, but some have had that experience. Just the promise or invitation of a richer experience in Eastern Orthodoxy seems attractive. So that's what's come up in my experience. Christian, you want to expand on that?
Yeah, so I think very similar things that I've seen as well. And I think it's worth recognizing that there are a few different avenues that might bring someone to check out Eastern Orthodoxy. And in the case of social media, you might not even be looking for it. And then you're confronted with a wise appearing priest with a long beard who is profound, and they have the nice soundtrack to go with it. So I think that's part of it. But then I think a big part of it also goes in the more practical kind of political side of things, where I think lots of people are rightly talking about a vibe shift in terms of politics, what people are seeking. So you have already conservative leaning evangelicals who might be frustrated with things like the separation of church and state. So Scott and I are Baptists, that's bread and butter for us. And people are craving, and I think with fair reason, some more engagement and more prophetic speaking to the culture. And you get something like Eastern Orthodoxy, which is coming and presenting with a traditional framing of culture with all sorts of messaging about here's where families are celebrated, here's where tradition is valued. Look at these ancient medieval kind of connections, all that kind of stuff, and the icons. It's all very visual and it looks historic. So in Eastern Orthodoxy, you get not only the sense of I can feel free being conservative, but now I can engage my religion along conservative lines as well. So I think especially for young men, it's a full package deal with the traditional and social rhetoric right now as well.
I'll go back to something you said, Scott, and an interesting point that we have our defenses against Roman Catholicism as Protestants. It's in the name.
Yeah.
But perhaps not so much against Orthodoxy, and that might be a problem there and then. It's interesting. Can you explain more in terms of church and state? It may not be something that we have to deal with so much in Australia, but it may be more a North American or indeed that country to the south of you is their problem. I'm not sure. What do you mean by that?
Yeah, so just to elaborate a little bit, I think there is a sense that this might be a Canadian thing, so I can't speak for Americans on that. But I think there is a hesitancy from the pulpit to directly engage in political issues.
Right.
So we have a lot of political conversations happening here, probably shared across the West, but you think about the family with marriage and abortion. Canada's talking a lot about euthanasia. All those kind of things right here. I think young men especially are frustrated. Why isn't the church doing more, speaking more? And then you could go online, social media, you will see in Eastern European countries, Orthodox priests who are cleansing the streets with holy oil after a pride parade, or you see them marching through, I can't remember which Eastern European capital, but leading a pro-family march in Serbia or somewhere like that. And I can understand the impulse saying, yeah, those are priests who take on a kind of Old Testament prophetic vibe where my Protestant pastor is too afraid to say a politician by name in the pulpit. Yeah.
And I guess there are some also Protestant denominations and congregations that actually are leading the way in terms of following what where society leads. And so I see converts from that background as well going, oh my goodness, my pastor doesn't even believe that Jesus was God. Where am I going to go to find that kind of stability? Orthodox Church, continuity with the early church, they believe all these things. Yeah, no, I think that's correct. The question that I think about, and I think Scott, you mentioned about men being attracted to the manliness of Orthodoxy. I think that's right. My question is, if young men are looking for an assertion of gender and gender roles, or perhaps complementarianism, or they can find that in evangelical churches. I suspect that in addition, what they're getting in Orthodoxy is a way to merit your salvation, and that is what attracts them there, which we can't offer because it's not true. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I think there's definitely something to that. I think one of the conversations that comes to mind when you mention that, and it wasn't necessarily about Eastern Orthodoxy, but it was just someone wrestling with salvation and justification biblically, and the response was, it can't be that easy.
Mm,
Surely I have to do something,
mm,
right? It can't be simply just that Jesus paid it all.
mm,
And I think you're right. There is a sense of the masculinity, as Christian mentioned, the like your conservative family values and whatnot, that you can find that in evangelicalism, but there is something where young men feel like Eastern Orthodoxy kind of puts the tool in their hand and puts them to work in something that they can accomplish, where just coming to my evangelical church on Sunday and maybe serving in children's ministry or whatnot isn't filling that
mm.
need. I think there's definitely something to that. I mean, we're always tempted to various ways of trying to work for our own salvation and merit our own salvation. And I think there is a sense of that too. Yeah, so I would agree. I think that's right, and something that we can definitely hit on in conversations with particularly young men who are attracted to something like Eastern Orthodoxy.
Yes, I think men in particular are, because they're task oriented, they're looking for something to do, and they may hear salvation by grace and hear, oh, so I'm passive, I don't do anything now. So, so they may be hearing antinomianism. Um,
Hmm.
Come into the tent, and that's it. You don't you sit back and relax. I
Hmm.
think one of the things we need to be saying to them, indeed, to Orthodox people, is no, we're not antinomian. It's the order that's the difference. Come in, you are saved by grace, and now guess what? God's putting you to work
Hmm.
in service of Him. So I think we need to be saying that too.
Yeah, it's that logic of Ephesians 2, right? You are saved by grace for good works which God prepared beforehand for you to walk in, right?
Yeah.
Absolutely.
So you suggest in the article that the numbers converting are not great, but do you have any ideas of how many we're talking about? And here we're pulling anecdotes together, I think, which is it's all we've got.
Yeah.
Hmm.
So I did some of the research in getting into that. So I think that's a place where, um, again, it is very hard with numbers in general and census information. How exactly do you track all that?
Mm,
Where I was sort of putting that together is that you have a lot of high quality Eastern Orthodox bloggers who, for their own purposes, are pulling together a lot of information from various parishes, from various dioceses. So there was some I've been tracking since 2017 out of my own interest with Hank Hanegraaff's conversion. But since then, various bloggers have been putting out information where they will suggest that while certain parishes are doing
mm,
incredibly well with converts, when you bring all the numbers together and account for all the cradle Orthodox who, once they arrive in North America, or I presume Australia as well, those numbers essentially even out, where the growth isn't as fantastic as news stories might recognize or might represent it as, where certain parishes could be booming that are attracting converts, while other parishes could be shutting down doors at the same time. So,
mm. Yeah, well, I'd be very interested in get some stats on converts, to actually to survey why they converted. That'd be an interesting survey to conduct, and what Orthodox people believe. So dear listeners, if you're listening to this and you've got a background in conducting surveys and crunching numbers and would be interested in pursuing that project, I'd please do contact me and let me know. I will say that in the last 2 weeks, um, since your article came out, there have been two other articles on this very issue of converts to Orthodoxy from evangelical backgrounds. One posted in Proclaim and Defend by Kevin Sharl, describing this same issue in Baptist churches, and the other by Jonathan Clark, who works on campuses with Reformed University Fellowship. And when I contacted Jonathan Clark, he said he had been inundated with responses to the article. So it does
Hmm.
suggest that many people have faced this issue and have concerns. So it's an issue.
There are 220 million people of Eastern Orthodox background across the world. They are our neighbours, our accountants and healthcare workers, and the parents of our children's friends. Yet many of us know little about Eastern Orthodoxy. Evangelising Eastern Orthodoxy is a free training course which equips you to understand Orthodox worldview and doctrines to help you effectively communicate the gospel. Each of the 8 modules features short video introductions explaining Orthodoxy, accompanied by practical evangelistic exercises. These are designed to be run in small groups at church or at home. Whether you're leading a church, facilitating a small group, or simply want to be a better friend or family member, this course is designed for you. The whole course, videos and printable studies are available free at eeo.net.au.
So while there may not be many, why are you concerned about those who are converting?
Yeah, so I think this is where Scott and I probably had similar experiences or similar thoughts. In my mind, again, I don't get too many questions when you compare it to a church of 300. I might have 2 or 3 who are coming up to me. So it's not a explosion of people, but I can't help but notice in my experience, those 2 or 3 are sometimes the most theologically interested people, the ones who, as I framed in the article, that I might expect to lead a Bible study or a prayer meeting a few years down the line, where it just so happens that the same people who I'm thinking, wow, these are people who actually listen to a 40-minute expository sermon and get something out of it, or the same people who I send them a TGC article on Athanasius, they'll read it, are now the same people who are interested in Eastern Orthodoxy. So to me, it's very much the type of people that are gravitating towards Eastern Orthodoxy is concerning on that level, not so much the number of people.
And some of the people in leadership positions as well.
Yeah, big time.
Yeah. So I've had chats with campus leaders recently, and I've heard a few stories of their leaders, most often deceptively, investigating Eastern Orthodoxy and not telling anyone, and then all of a sudden one day saying, "Well, I'm off. I'm leaving."
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's very concerning. So what do converts feel they're not getting in their local church?
I think a couple things just continue to reoccur is this idea of in my Evangelical Protestant church, I'm very much a spectator. I show up on Sunday morning and I'm there for the performance, the worship team on the stage, the pastor preaching, and even the whole experience of the sacraments is more of a tag on at the end, or not a real part of the worship experience where they're participating. And it's this difference of I'm feel like a spectator in my church and I want to be a participant. And what they feel like they're going to get in something like Eastern Orthodox is participation in worship, and the whole idea of theosis, right, is participation in the life of God. And that's part of what they feel like they're not getting in their church. I'm here as a spectator to watch other people do the work. A part of it comes back to that work thing again, right? Like I want to be involved, I want to participate, and I'm not getting that in my church. I'm very much a spectator there, and so it's a mixture of some of those things, and then also the whole idea of being disconnected from history, right? And that appeal of and the Roman Catholic Church has this too, in a sense, right? That appeal of we can trace our roots all the way back to the apostles. And my evangelical pastor never mentions anyone older than Billy Graham, or even younger than that, right? And it's this sense of, well, where do we fit in history? And so some of those things just keep coming up over and over again. I don't know, Christian, what do you see something different?
Yeah, I'll start there, Scott, and I would very much agree. It's often the case, and I think same thing with Roman Catholicism, of course, but this idea of being in line with the early church, and early church always means coincidentally after the New Testament, but coming across perhaps a quote from Ignatius and seeing that he talks about bishops. And then, well, my evangelical church doesn't have a bishop, or seeing images from the early church and seeing icons. Granted, they're often early churches, 8th and 9th century, but seeing these icons, and my church is so plain. That doesn't look like the early church, or at least a person's conception of the early church. So I think it's that visible and perhaps that tangible conformity with the early church that they're feeling evangelicals are missing. But even building from there, I think it is the idea of participation, where yes, my evangelical church, I can hear a sermon, I can maybe serve in kids ministry, but I want to be doing more. I want to engage my whole being. So if you were to compare with what does an evangelical do for a spiritual practice, well, I might read my Bible and pray, but if I go online and I see an Eastern Orthodox person, they'll have this beautiful icon wall in their room, and they will bow and pray and repeat the Jesus prayer. And it is this wonderful kind of engaging spirituality. So I think that catches a number of people who want to engage more of themselves, and they, in their perception, don't believe evangelicalism offers that sort of engagement.
There is a supreme irony in that, because Orthodoxy, I suppose, if you're keen, I guess I'm speaking as a cradle Orthodox rather than a convert. So a convert would tend to be more keen and go in for the spiritual disciplines, but Orthodoxy fundamentally is passive. You are entering into the church, and it is all done to you. You are there, and it's happening. The priest is doing it for you. The experience is enveloping you, and that's what's happening. So at an Orthodox wedding, for instance, the couple that are getting married do not say a word. Nothing is said. They do not make any promises, nothing. It's all done to them. And that's just typical of Orthodoxy. So that's that's interesting. That I think what you're saying is correct. It is, but I think it's one of those ironic things that they are seeking something and trying to find it in Orthodoxy, but I would suggest it's not there.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And it's interesting thinking about that, right? And how are they first introduced to it? Well, it's not necessarily from the perspective of a convert to it. It's not necessarily through a flesh and blood cradle Orthodox bringing them to their church or whatnot, right? It's through the influencer, the YouTube apologist, right? And that's what's held out. So it's really about the perception, and that's a fascinating contrast that you bring out, that it really is passive. I remember hearing that when we were on our tour with the tour group and going in, and there was a curtain which the priest would stand behind and come out and do the whole service in a language nobody understood. And yeah, it was very interesting, right? And one of our tour group members commented like, "Well, I can't come here. I need to go somewhere where I can hear the Bible and with my Bible open," kind of sitting. So yeah, that's a very interesting. That gives me something to think about for next conversation with someone. Is it really more participatory, or is it more passive? That's fascinating.
As I say, I think you can participate more, but fundamentally it's not about you going and doing your own thing. Not at all. No. You are entering into the community because the church is the ark of salvation. So the way you enter into salvation is being a part of that community, and that is how you enter into the experience. That is how you receive the graces of God, especially through communion and through baptism. It's through the church. It's not there's no independent thinking, there's no independent action per se. So even when you are engaging in the Jesus prayer or fasting, that you are participating in the life of the church. You're not representing you're not approaching God individually through Jesus. You're approaching God through the church. Join us again next week for part 2 of our discussion with Scott and Christian. We talk about how to be proactive in addressing the concerns of converts before they leave, what to say to them if they do, and why it's helpful to gain an understanding of Eastern Orthodoxy. Thanks for listening to Evangelizing Eastern Orthodoxy. Continue to pray for your Orthodox neighbours and friends, and seek to emulate Paul, who declared to the Corinthians, "We plead on Christ's behalf, be reconciled to God. He made the one who did not know sin to be sin for us, so that in him we might become the righteousness of God."
My